Hello neighbors, Ariana from the Therapist Next Door here. Welcome back. So today I wanted to talk about toxic relationships and why a lot of us are addicted to them or have a hard time getting out of them. Now, I feel like the term toxic when it comes to relationships has been thrown around a lot in the past few years. And I think the reason for that is because there can be a lot of different situations that could be looked at as toxic. So I wanted to first off start by talking about some different examples of toxic relationships, because there's not just one, there's a lot of different ways that relationships can be toxic. Out of curiosity, I just first Googled the definition of toxic, and of course the first definition is poisonous. The second definition is very harmful or unpleasant in a pervasive or insidious way, and that was referencing a toxic relationship. So I wanted to kind of have that as a baseline. But just to start giving examples of toxic relationships, abusive relationships are absolutely toxic. So any form of abuse, whether it be sexual, emotional, verbal, physical, financial, there's neglect, there's a lot of different kinds of abuse, that for sure would be considered toxic. What I'm going to be spending most of the time in this video covering is examples that are maybe a little bit more in the gray area. Maybe you're wondering if this is toxic or if it isn't. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about here. Let's start by talking about toxic relationships where boundaries are crossed or there's a lack of respect. If you or your partner regularly cross boundaries like yell, name call, cuss at each other, do things that your partner has asked you not to do, and this happens repetitively, that is definitely toxic. And you are going to want to look at that and you're going to want to get help for that. So if you've already tried to bring it up to your partner and they're not respecting those boundaries, and you yourself are maybe working on not crossing those boundaries, unfortunately, that may mean that you're with somebody that's not capable of respecting your boundaries. And if you remain in that situation, then you are deciding to remain in a toxic relationship that is not only detrimental to yourself, but also detrimental to basically everybody involved in that situation. It's very hard to get out of these situations, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But anything where there's repetitive lack of respect or repetitive crossing of boundaries that have already been defined is most definitely considered toxic. Now, this one might be a little controversial, but let's say that you have the same fight over and over and over again with your partner. I also consider that toxic. Let's say that you are fighting about whatever it may be. It might be about money, it might be about thirds, it might be about boundaries. Now, if you guys aren't coming up with a plan, if you're not either reading a book or talking to a therapist or figuring out what you are going to do differently so that you don't contribute to the same issue, then you're basically in a toxic cycle, and that fosters a toxic relationship. If you find yourself having the same fight over and over and over and over with your partner, you really want to get a handle on that, and you want to really talk about not necessarily what you're even fighting about, but the fact that it's happening over and over again, and really dive a little bit deeper. Do you guys just have, differences that are insurmountable about the way you look at life or the way you look at relationships? Is one or both of you unwilling to do the work that's necessary to have a healthy relationship? Again, if that's the case, you might be choosing to remain in a toxic relationship. And what's happening is, yes, of course, you are doing damage to yourself, but you're also not allowing yourself to really work on the things that you need to work on with a partner who's willing to do the work, and or to call in the partner who is ready and who you deserve to be in your life. Because what you're telling the universe is, hey, I'm okay with this. I'm okay with this toxicity. This is what I deserve. And so you're just going to keep getting more of the same, having the same issue over and over and over again with no plan to address it, no changes happening. That is something that I would consider to be toxic. The last category I would say is when it comes to anything that is like gaslighting. So you constantly don't feel heard by your partner. They never seem to take accountability for anything. You bring things up and all of a sudden it gets turned around on you. Somehow you're always to blame blame. Those things are very, very toxic things. A lot of those traits do fall with somebody who they might have some traits of narcissism. So you really want to be careful with that. A lot of people throw that term around as well. Now, people who truly meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, you really want to be careful with labeling that, because personality disorders are pervasive, meaning that without serious intervention and that person actually wanting to change, they usually don't change, even sometimes with treatment. But a lot of us have traits that are part of personality disorders. We just don't have the full-blown list to meet the criteria for a personality disorder. If you constantly feel like you are not being heard, or when your partner gets angry with you, they tend to devalue you, you feel bad about yourself, this is very, very toxic, and I highly recommend that you consider making a plan to get out of this relationship if you have already addressed these concerns and there are no changes being made. So those are a few. That is not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the common dynamics that I can think of that are toxic. If you have any other examples that you're wondering, is this toxic, is it not toxic, feel free to drop it in the comments. Now I'm going to talk about why we tend to either be drawn into toxic situations and why it's so hard to get out of them. What typically tends to happen is that we subconsciously attract partners in, or even people may be attracted to us, where we reenact similar dynamics from our childhood or even from previous relationships. You're not a bad person because you find yourself in toxic relationships. In fact, it's not even your fault. So I really want you to understand that first and foremost and give yourself some grace. So we tend to reenact what we know. This is all happening on a subconscious level. Our psyche likes what feels familiar. Oh, yelling, a defensiveness, talking back and forth, all those kinds of things, unhealthy dynamics. If that's something that you're familiar with, your psyche's like, oh, I know how to deal with this. This is familiar. But familiar isn't always good, because if we want things to be different, let's say we maybe didn't have the best examples of relationships growing up, but we want to have healthier relationships, we are going to have to become aware of that, and then we're going to have to do the work. And not only that, we're going to have to be able to let go of partners that aren't ready to do that work with us, or are still maybe not aware of their own unhealthy dynamics. It takes a lot of work to be able to change this, and it's not easy. It's not easy to end relationships because we become attached to people, and separation anxiety is a real thing. But there's a lot of support out there when it comes to breakups, and this video is not really about breakups, but more so normalizing how hard it is to get out of these situations and why. And why is because, again, we're very comfortable with what we know. It feels familiar. Sometimes that familiarity feels good. It feels secure. It's like, even if this person yells at me, at least I know what to expect here. So again, we just want to bring some awareness. Now, with that awareness, we really, really want to bring in compassion towards ourselves. So there's a Buddhist term called Maitri, and it's all about self-compassion. We really need to meet ourselves where we're at. When we can do that with love and kindness, that usually helps us move through and make those difficult decisions that we have to make. It usually makes things a little bit more bearable if we can just remember to be kind and give ourselves grace instead of judging ourselves. Hopefully there's something that you picked up out of this video that was helpful if you're in a toxic relationship, or maybe you've been in one, or maybe some red flags you can look out for when you're going to be in a relationship in the future. Again, I'm here to help, so I will see you guys soon. Let me know what you think in the comments. Authentically yours, Ariana.